Do you ever do any flying privately for yourself at all, Rick?
Well, I don't know. Is that an offer, Paul?
Indeed, I was just going to say if you are getting withdrawal symptoms, you just let us know. You've got an open invitation.
Well, you know what? I mean, any excuse for a clutch, I'll be in the car like a shot.
Hang on, are you type rated on an R44, or do you just do Chinooks?
I am not type rated on an R44.
I'm already getting sinister thoughts, thinking let's stick him in the Cadbury G2 and see if he can handle that.
Now that's the machine I'd be very interested in.
It's a terrific little helicopter. It's lively.
Too much right foot.
Yep. Incredibly responsive. I mean, you twitch the cyclic and it's instantly rolling or pitching instantaneously.
Yeah, well, I'd like to say it sounds like an ideal trainer. I'm not sure it does. No.
Oh well, we'll talk about that, Rich. And I think that's a cracking idea for you to come down and come and have a go.
Right, okay. Well, let's consider it a deal. Fair exchange.
I think that's a fair exchange. Right. I think we've got quite a few people at the moment. There's bound to be more coming in, so I'll just let them in as they come along. But otherwise, for those of you that remember Rich from last time, this is Rich, Catherine's my wife's uncle. For those that you didn't remember last time, this is Rich, Catherine's uncle. He's got some amazing, and I say stories, of course, they're not stories, they're not made up. It's real life experiences that he's very kindly shares both online, but as in via a website, etc., and books as well. I think you've written, haven't you, Rich?
Oh, I haven't written any books. Articles, maybe.
Articles, sorry, yeah. But as you know, joining us tonight. So without any further ado, Rich, the stage is yours.
Good, thank you very much, Paul. Well, firstly, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for having me back. It's always a pleasure to talk to like-minded communities, and the opportunity afforded me to actually go back through my own history and make notes as I go along was surprisingly quite pleasurable, because many incidents I'd actually forgotten about. So it's been great fun preparing, and hopefully I'll be able to get some of that across to you as an audience. So the format I intend to do is to not have it particularly structured. It is informal. So in essence, it's a bit more like a fireside chat. I'm certainly not making this a presentation or a lecture, but what I do hope is that as we go along, we'll touch on some key themes, and some lessons, issues will drop out, which you can either ask me to go into some further detail, or indeed that may trigger some questions that you might have, whether in respect to my experiences or how it may relate to something that you've seen or you've done or you might be interested in. So hopefully that will work for you, the audience. The one thing that does amuse me is that the word aviation is very closely followed by, in the alphabet, by bloviation. And obviously aviation is the art of flying, and bloviation is the art of talking at length about nothing in particular. And now clearly that is not my intention. So if at any point I do seem to be drifting on and on without a point, then do feel free to flag it up and drag me back on course. So that sets the scene. I am Rich Luck. I'm currently a flight lieutenant in the Royal Air Force. I say currently because I've been several different ranks before, and I've actually left the service twice and then come back in for a third time, and I will explain how on earth I went about doing that. But my aviation career, if you like, started at a very young age, when I realised that flying was something which was definitely very exciting. And I do recall as a youngster being mad keen on airfix models, building those up. I'm sure most of you have been there, and going to air shows with my parents And I was fortunate that my father also had an RAF background, and so therefore he was very, very keen on supporting those interests. So I've been into aviation for quite some time, and likewise my twin brother Chris, who you might just be able to make out, we'll share a photo up there, is also an RAF helicopter pilot, and we both enjoyed exploring what aviation had to offer in the early years. For example, through things like the Air Training Corps, which is a fantastic institution for our youngsters, and an absolutely superb gateway into service in the RAF or the wider military. And I certainly would strongly advocate that our youth continue to be encouraged to join organisations like that. So yeah, so I was a space cadet for a while, and enjoyed all that had to offer. And I do recall in particular one occasion going to RAF Honington, which back then was an active flying station, and home to the Buccaneer Force. And we were on a summer camp, and I was hosted by the 12 Squadron Buccaneers, which we'd had been shown a cine film about in our Air Training Corps hut. And of course it was cine film back then, so it was all very exciting. And it was all about 12 Squadron Buccaneers. So to actually go to the home of the squadron and to be hosted by them was something incredibly exciting. And the highlight of the week was being selected as one of several cadets to go and fly in the Buccaneer simulator. Very different to simulators now. It was very basic, but the cockpit was realistic, and it was as close to a fast jet as I imagined I would ever get. So so the excitement was quite intense. I was the last to go, and as I was strapped in, I received the briefing from the flight lieutenant who was supervising us, and he patted me on the shoulder and said, "Right, enjoy." And he climbed off the simulation deck. Pilot in front who was flying said, "Right, off we go." Applied full power, and I could see all the needles moving, and the camera was starting to track along the runway on this enormous model that was mounted vertically on a wall. Again, no clever digital stuff back then. And then just as he said, "Right, and here we are airborne," and the undercarriage being selected up, suddenly everything just literally turned upside down and we crashed. And the aircraft, the simulation, had suffered an engine failure. Now, it wasn't deliberate, it was just a software glitch. And I do recall one being very disappointed at actually not having managed to fly a sortie, but nonetheless being very excited that I'd actually been in a Buccaneer simulator. So just that little taste, even though it was, I said, very much cut short, was enough to confirm in my mind that this was definitely something which I wanted to do. So the answer was quite simple: go back to school, work hard, get the qualifications necessary, and get myself down to Biggin Hill. And that's what I eventually did in 1985. And when I went to Biggin Hill, the selection process was, I think by modern standards, quite archaic. Whereas now you've got to be very adept at video games, essentially. Back then, it was very much steering wheels and metal pointers and black dots going up and down on a conveyor belt device, and lots of written exams. To cut a long story short, that was 3 days of selection, and on the third day, after all the tests were done, we were waiting in the common room to be called forward, and I was called forward eventually. I went in, and a very senior looking squadron leader bade me to come in, sit down, and then he fixed me with what I thought was a sorrowful look, and he said, "I'm really sorry to have to inform you that you have that you failed selection. Of course, you can imagine I was somewhat shocked. And I said, well, can you give me some details on that? And he said, well, yes. He said, you failed the navigator test. And I was rather confused at this, and I said, somewhat naively, but I haven't applied to be a navigator. I've applied to be a pilot. To which he looked at me and somewhat bemusedly and said, yeah, but you've got to be able to navigate in order to be a pilot on an aeroplane. And again, I wouldn't accept this, because this has been everything which I've been leading up to for years. And I said, well, but surely, what can I do to make it right? And he went into his notes and he had a look and he said, well, he said, you failed the maths. So he had me there, because I was terrible at maths. And I said on the spot, I can work on that and I can improve on it. You know, please just give me this chance. And he looked at his notes, and I could see he was thinking about it. And eventually he looked up and said, okay. He said, I'll give you the chance, and we can say that you've passed. Now, looking back on it, I can only imagine that he was rather short on his quota for pilot selection, and I was marginal, and he gave me the benefit of the doubt. So I was selected for flying training. Now, the truth of the matter is that I did struggle with the math side of it for quite some time to come, but nonetheless, it was worth the effort for working that little bit harder. So I ended up going to Cranwell, initial officer training, in 1986. Now, the day I started was also the day that I had ticket for the Wimbledon's men's final. As you can imagine, I was a little bit torn, but it was in the end, it wasn't too hard a decision as to where I was going to report, and on time as well. So initial officer training was fine. I won't say I particularly enjoyed the experience, but neither did I find it particularly onerous. And it was only back then 18 weeks. And then graduating from that, I, as acting pilot officer, Rich Luck, went to RAF Swindeby, which was then home of the flying selection squadron. And I was then put through the ground school for the Chipmunk T Mark 10, and we then went on to the flying phase. Now, the Chipmunk was a tremendous aircraft, but even then it was somewhat long in the tooth. We're talking 87 now, but absolutely loved flying it, and Swindeby was a great place to be. The course was great. The instructors were fabulous, and I have to say that it was one of the most fun things that I did in my RAF training career. The standout story for that was on solo day, when we all one by one went off and did our first solos, and for the majority of us it went absolutely fine, but there was one student who on his first approach to land thumped it into the runway very, very hard, bounced high into the air, did absolutely the right thing, been trained to do, full throttle, went around again, only he was streaming fuel from underneath his wings, because he'd hit the ground so hard that he'd actually punctured the fuel tanks, having driven the undercarriage up into the bottom of the wings. But anyway, he went round, the fire brigade was alerted, the ambulance was on standby, and he came in, did a good landing, but then managed to ground loop his way to a standstill. And to this day, I can remember him walking across the dispersal, parachute over his shoulder, just muttering to himself that he was never going to do that again. But for the rest of us, this didn't put us off. and we all then moved on to basic flying training, which was on the Jet Provost Mark V at RAF Cranwell. I just pause for a moment there because my screen has gone blank, and I just want to make sure that everyone is still there. Paul?
Yeah, Rich, yeah.
Yeah, still here.
Still here.
Yeah,
See you.
That's great. So from the Chipmunk T Mark 10 to the Jet Provost Mark V, which was quite a significant leap, and it was of course preceded by ground school, and our chief ground instructor was Squadron Leader Wheeler. He was known as Wacky Wheeler because he was slightly eccentric, to put it mildly, but he put us through ground school. He made sure that we were all extremely attentive, and part of the ground school, I think in the 4th or 5th week, in order to encourage us, was to go on a trip in the JP5. We weren't expected to do anything other than just sit and watch and enjoy and be enthused further for the remainder of ground school. And I do recall that the trip went by very, very quickly, and we'd taken off and landed before I'd even really appreciated what was going on. I think I was still concerned as to whether I'd actually strapped myself in properly onto this ejection seat, which I'd never been on before. And my instructor at the time asking me whether I'd enjoyed it, and I had to look at him in dismay and say, "I think so," and again realised that I was going to have to really put my head down and get some serious work in order to prepare for the flying training. Again, Jet Provost, affectionately known as the fixed thrust variable noise jet. It was a good training aircraft. It was steady, it was reliable, and by the end of the course, we had all realised that we actually quite enjoyed flying it. And of course, we could get some reasonable speeds out of the Jet Provost. We could fly up to, gosh, I've got to try and remember. I think I managed to get to 350 knots in a dive. Now, compared to Chipmunk, that was quite something. And we would fly at low level between 240 and 280 knots, and that was quite a challenge. And I started to suspect that perhaps fast jets might not be my forte. One of the sorties that we had to do was a mixed low level to high level, then back to low level before recovery back to RAF Cranwell.
Gosh, on a Thursday.
So that's so we took off on Cranwell. We climbed up through cloud. This is solo. Joined a beacon, and then flew down from Lincolnshire all the way down into Norfolk, where I used a radar service to descend below the cloud. And my low-level entry point was a disused airfield in Norfolk. Now, for some of you, you may well have flown in Norfolk, and you'll have instantly spotted my mistake, because even then there are a lot of disused airfields in Norfolk, and there are far more now, all these years later. So as we came out of cloud, at the base at about 10,000 feet, the visibility was excellent. And I was flying on a 500,000 scale map. And as I looked ahead for my disused airfield, I could find at least 6 which looked like the one on my 500,000 scale map. And they all seemed to be in more or less the same place. And I had to make a quick decision, which was to select one. So I did, and set off on heading, started the stopwatch, and then obviously looked for my next turning point. And one of the things that we'd always been taught was that heading and time was key. Look from the map to ground, find your feature, but if you weren't certain, turn on heading and time. And essentially that's what I did for the next 20 minutes flying through Norfolk. Not really sure of where I was, but being reasonably confident that I was in the right ballpark. Eventually, I called RF Maru and gave them my student call sign and said that I was approximately 5 miles south of them, heading west. To which point they said, "You're not. You're actually to the east of us, and you're heading straight for us. So we suggest you turn south immediately," which I did. Thanked them and went on my merry way, having been now a reappraisal where I actually was. So lots going on, and I worried about that all the way back to Cranwell, because I was sure that they were going to report me. So I got back to Cranwell, handed the aircraft in, went back to the operations on the squadron. And my QFI asked me how it went, and I said, well, it was okay, apart from I think I may have got rather close to RF Marum. And he said to me at that point, "Don't worry, we've got bigger fish to fry." And I was a bit curious about that. And as it turned out, one of the other students had chosen to descend into low level using his air brakes, then had forgotten to retract them. And he'd been flying around Norfolk and then back up with his air brakes out, obviously consuming rather more fuel than he should have been, and then having to divert into Wittering on a fuel priority. So that kind of got me off the hook, but again gave me lots of things to think about as I went forward. So that was flying training on the Jet Provost. All the course got selected for Hawk at Valley, but as we were marched into our squadron crew room, the boss said, "Well done, you've all passed, but I've got some bad news for you." And that's how he put it. He said, "Unfortunately," he said, "I have to have someone to send to helicopters." And I put my hand up instantly, and he looked at me, and the staff looked at me, and all the other students looked at me, and he said, "Sorry, you did hear me." I said that I need someone to go helicopters, and I said, "Yeah, absolutely. I'm more than happy to do that." And it raised a few eyebrows, because of course back then, everyone wanted to be a fast jet pilot, didn't they? But what they didn't know at the time was that my brother Chris was on 33 Squadron. He was flying Pumas, and I had been going down to Odium on occasion and going flying with him and other members of the squadron. And I realised back then that actually helicopter flying was just fantastic fun. This idea of taking off and landing vertically and going and landing in fields and clearings in woods and flying troops and operating out of tents was just great fun. So I volunteered, and much to their surprise and to the disgust of some, I was graduated and packed off, and off I went to RF Shawbury, and started my helicopter flying training career. Now back then it was number 2 helicopter flying training school with Gazelles as the first part of what was advanced flying training, followed by the Wessex HC Mark II as the second part, so single engine onto the twin engine. And that was tremendous fun. I loved flying the Gazelle, an incredibly nimble machine, and it was quick, and it was very basically equipped, but nonetheless it was great fun to fly, and great fun to learn the basics of helicopter operations. So that went okay, and then I was moved on to 2 Squadron, as it was, on the Wessex. Now that was quite a significant transition. For a start, you had to climb up the outside of the aircraft onto what felt like the second floor of a building. It was so high up. So one step onto the wheel, then another step, sliding window, and then into the side of the aircraft, with the cabin and the crewmen some way behind and down from where the pilots were sitting. And of course, the Wessex cockpit, being of its era, was incredibly old-fashioned, incredibly complex, as much as it was full of dials and gauges and switches, just all over the place, and it was bewildering at first. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure I ever managed to learn all the checks properly off by heart. Now, a lot of that was down to the simple fact that with so few aircraft available, they used to work them very, very hard. So they'd start up a Wessex in the morning and then essentially run it for as long as they could before it needed servicing and refueling, and just keep the aircraft rotors turning, and then just keep changing crews. So if you were unfortunate with your timings, you could actually spend an entire week where you might never start the aircraft or never stop it, because you're always just getting in the aircraft in the middle part of the day, or you might just only do starts, or you might find that you've only done stops. And again, it reminds me of one occasion when I was on the first wave. So I started the aircraft, and of course the night before I knew I was on the first wave, so I very carefully studied the whole startup procedure, refreshed myself, and just made sure that I was familiar with those. Only when we got back after our 2-hour sortie, we had a message to say that change of flying training program, and that we were for shutdown. So we taxied in onto the parking spot, and I just had a complete blank, absolute complete blank. My instructor, who was known as Stopey, superb fellow, he just looked at me and just said, all right, anytime you're ready. And I had to look at him and just say, I honestly can't remember where we start from. He looked at me and just said, okay, just this once, you can get your cards out, but don't do it again. And so therefore I actually used my cards to do that shutdown. But again, another lesson learned was, don't let skills fade and knowledge fade, and just because you haven't used them in a while. So that was Wessex. And again, on graduation, I was fortunate enough to be selected for Chinook. So I was fortunate enough because the majority of my course actually ended up going to the Army Air Corps, because back then the Army Air Corps was short of pilots, and the Air Force was able to let them have a few. So some of my course mates went to Germany, some went to Middle Wallop, some went to Netheravon, and other than one student who went to search and rescue at Valley, I was the only one who actually went to an RAF aircraft on that course. So I was quite fortunate. So that took me to RF Odin in 1989, and the Chinook Mark I, as it was then, and I joined number 22 Chinook OCU on what was 240 operational conversion unit. And again, rather like the step up to the Wessex, from the Gazelle, the step up from the Wessex to the Chinook was another order of magnitude. Not so much in the flying of the aircraft, but most certainly in the learning how to operate it. It was quite an intense 6 months with several downs as well as a few ups as well. When I say downs, so for example, I think my mid-course check I failed twice, and I failed the end of course once. But again, perseverance, not willing to be downhearted, and then just getting back in the books and understanding where I'd gone wrong, and aiming to do better. If you like, sheer perseverance and pig-headedness got me through the course in the end. But it was, as I said, it was challenging, and I had a superb instructor called Andy Strachan, who won't mind me name checking him, who I recall on one occasion put together what should have been an epic sortie with a whole combination of stuff involving departing Odium, ending up on a diversion to an airfield on the south coast, into a pretend task, and then back to Odium at the end of the day. Well, I and my fellow trainee actually managed to get lost just after the departure gate from Odium. Now, our excuse was that we weren't particularly familiar with the Tactical Air Navigation System, or TANS, as it was back then. A very basic device, worked on Doppler and air data, and needed a lot of management to make sure that it was accurate. And of course, what we'd done was, departing Odium, we hadn't quite used the correct coordinates. So by the time we got to the first gate, it was actually off. As we set off from the gate, because we could see it from Odium, and as we got there heading in time, and Andy Strachan, who was in the jump seat, said, so don't forget to check the TANS. We looked at the TANS, and it wasn't saying what we thought it was going to say. So he said, well, okay, you need to sort it out. So we thought, okay, sort it out, go into an orbit, and then sort it out. So my student colleague and I, between the two of us, tried to get fixed back into the correct position, and we made such a hash of it that eventually the instructor said, do you know what, this isn't working, take me back to Odium and we'll start again. At which point we both looked at him and sort of said, which way is that then? Much to my shame and embarrassment, and he pointed us the way that we needed to go, and back we went. So yeah, not the best of sorties, but thankfully we did continue to improve after that, after a very thorough and lengthy debrief. But again, that what the Air Force was very good at, and is still very good at, is the art of the debrief, and making sure that what you get from it is not just a critique, but also a how to improve, how to get things right, and then to be afforded an opportunity to do that. So certainly, as you all go forward in your flying careers, very easy to get downhearted when things don't go right. But what's essential is that you actually understand why. Take no offence from others pointing out the why, and then just making sure that you get it right the next time. So after the Chinook OCU, I was fortunate enough to be selected to go to 7 Squadron at again at RFM, so basically just across the airfield. And essentially, I then started what was 15 years of Chinook operations, and during that time, got to see and got to do a lot. I was lucky enough to go to the Falkland Islands, to operate in Northern Ireland, and to operate in Bosnia, northern Iraq and southern Turkey, as well as lots of exercises around Europe and the Mediterranean and in Africa as well. And as you might imagine from that, an awful lot of stories and anecdotes, and quite frankly, it's hard to know which ones to point out. But I think the key lesson for me from that period was that one of operating as a crew, because again, with the Chinook being the large helicopter that it is, the standard crew was 4, so there'd be 2 of you in the cockpit, and then 2 down in the cabin, the two crewmen or 2 crew persons. Because when I started, there were no female air crew, and it was quite a number of years after I started flying before female air crew were accepted in, and they had gone on to obviously demonstrate quite very well indeed that they were always as equally capable as us fellas were. So crew cooperation was something which was learned on the Chinook very early on, obviously through the OCU, but in my operational career on it, I learned to use it as an effective tool, and on several occasions that crew cooperation did save our bacon. And again, I can think of occasions. So, for example, one time we were doing fighter affiliation up in the north. So, with fighter affiliation, basically what we are learning to do with a helicopter is avoid getting shot down by a fast jet. And we were training against a Hawk Mark 1, and we had gone through several manoeuvres, and it had all been going rather well. And then we broke off, and the Hawk had to depart to get some fuel. And as we were flying straight and level, we were about 1,000 feet heading south. The crewman at the back shouted very, very loudly, "Brake right." Now, under normal circumstances, you might stop and consider, well, why? Because the manoeuvres have stopped. We're up at 1,000 feet, and I did hesitate. I was a junior pilot at the time, but the senior pilot with me immediately broke right, and as we did so, a tornado, which came up from our 6 o'clock, went over the top of us, and I would suggest probably by about 20 or 30 feet over the top, directly. And as he went over the top, we could hear his jet engines, and then we could look straight down his exhaust pipes as he went past us in a slow climb on his way, probably pulling out of low level on the way back down south to the tornado bases in Norfolk. So that was a pretty close call. And again, it's all part of that crew cooperation that saved our bacon on that day. So what else can I tell you about operating Chinook in the early days? Falkland Islands was always great fun. I wasn't there for the war. Obviously, that was back in 1982. But when I started going there in the early 90s, much of the debris, if you like, from the war was still out and about. So it was very much a real thing for us. The radar sites were our bread and butter. It was our job to resupply those with food, with material for building and renovation, with fuel supplies as well, and obviously changing personnel over. And the radar sites were very remote, and the only access available at the time was via helicopter. So we were very much their lifeline. And the weather in the Falklands was extremely variable, from very clear, normally always windy, to thick fog, and it could change very, very quickly as well. So we learned a lot about operating in poor weather in the summer and in the winter, by day and by night. And we didn't have MVGs when I started going down there either, so it was very much normal, what we would now call reversionary night flying, but back then was standard night flying techniques. And that was all about studying the map, understanding what the elevation of the ground was, and then selecting a suitable altitude at which to cruise, and then select appropriate markers on a map, and then heading in time backed up by the tactical navigation system. And that all worked fine. But on one of my first trips down there, I was taught how to use our night sun, a very, very powerful steerable light on the front of the aircraft, to make an approach in the absence of a night landing aid, and back then it would be a NATO T, so literally a T shape of lights with each of the 3 lights at the head separated by 10 meters, and 2 lights on the tail separated by 10 meters, if I remember correctly. Well, if that weren't available, then we would use the night sun. And down on the south in Lafonia, which was very flat, very dark, no lights at all, we had a metal pole stuck in the ground. It was only about 6 feet tall, with reflector tape wrapped all the way around it. And the training serial was to leave Mount Pleasant Airfield, fly down south into Lafonia, navigate our way to find the pole, and then make an approach to it, just using the searchlight and the Mark 1 eyeball. So off you went, and as we ran in towards the area, we had our navigation feature. We had our time, and we started to sweep the area ahead, looking for the reflection of the pole. And sure enough, we got it, flew to the top, fixed the towers, because by now I'd learned how to do it properly, first time, and in the right way, and then established a circuit to fly back to the pole. And then the approach was demonstrated to me by my instructor, because I'd never done one before. And we counted down on the town system the miles to run, had the pole in at 12 o'clock, and then at the descent point, he took control and then talked me down, and describing as he went what he was doing, what he was thinking, and all about keeping the pole fixed in place. And it was much of a surprise when the red alert warning went off, much sooner than we'd expected. And as we looked in, it was we noted that our rate of descent was much higher than it should have been, and actually we'd allowed ourselves to become fixated on the pole, and had inadequately monitored the instruments, and therefore we had a very high rate of descent, and thankfully reacted instantly, pulled in power. Vortex ring did not make itself seen on this occasion, thankfully, and we shot up like a cork in water, back up to a safe altitude, somewhat rattled, and then recovered to MPA, and talked again about what had happened. And again, another abject lesson in monitoring aircraft systems, monitoring the approach, and not talking oneself into a good approach when the evidence, if you're looking for it, says otherwise. So that was a truly salutary lesson about flying in the pitch dark, and not monitoring systems properly. So we eventually managed to fly that sortie again, got it right, and then carried on. And operations in the Falklands from then on were great fun. And one of my particular favourites was doing undersung loads off the resupply vessel and then flying them up to the mountaintop radar sites. and these were generally they're either ISO containers full of stuff, or underslung load nets with equipment. On one occasion, it wasn't when I did it, but the Chinook crew were very surprised that when they got the ISO to the top, the receiving troops opened it, and out trotted a number of soldiers who decided that it was much quicker getting up to the mountainside in the middle of an ISO than it was to make their way up by trekking. So again, as you might imagine, we did give some feedback on that as to why it was a good idea, because of course, had anything gone wrong with the helicopter, the first thing we would have done would have been to get rid of the underslung load, as you might imagine, thinking that there was nothing but equipment in it. So that was the Falkland Islands, and I think I did about 4 or 5 trips down there with varying levels of experience. And my final time was actually down there as the detachment commander. But even when you're relatively experienced, you can still make mistakes. And I do bring out the mistakes that I made, because it's very easy to talk about getting everything right, but actually the more valuable lessons are learned from where you got things wrong. And I think on this occasion, we were asked to fly an underslung load from Mount Pleasant Airfield across to West Island, and the wind was particularly strong on this occasion. The load was quite heavy, and we looked at the calculations and said that from our calculation, we said, well, we can't really do it, but we won't have enough fuel. And we were overridden. The commander at the time said, actually, no, I've done the sums. You've got enough. You can go and do it. As the aircraft captain, clearly it should have been my decision. And rather than just say, well, actually, no, I don't think we do, I caved in and said, okay, we'll give it a go. Cut a long story short, we didn't have enough fuel. We ended up having to abandon the load halfway and land on the other island, and then have to be rescued by the other Chinook, bringing fuel out to us. So the whole thing was a bit of a faff, quite frankly. And again, the lesson that I drew from that was to stick by your guns. If you've come up with a calculation that you think is right and somebody else says is wrong, then to get a third party to check it over and just make sure that everyone is absolutely spot on. So performance calculations, clearly not something you can afford to get wrong. We were lucky at that time; we were able to just land on, and the only thing that we suffered was an immense amount of embarrassment, as you might imagine, once we got back to the airfield. But so be it. Better to be embarrassed than anything else. So that's the Falkland Islands. Northern Ireland was always very interesting, but in the interest of time, I won't say much more about that. And I think we'll just jump on to Bosnia, which was a really interesting operating theatre. So that was in the mid 90s, from about 96 through to 98, when I was flying out there. By now, I was a qualified helicopter instructor. I was a tactics instructor, and I was also OCB flight on 18 Squadron. So I now had responsibility for a flight of men and women on operations. We were based in Split, on the coast in Croatia, which was very nice, very pleasant. But our operations were all done in Bosnia from a forward operating base in a northern town called Banja Luka. and we from there we would fly troops and equipment as tasks all around Bosnia itself, including trips down to Sarajevo and back. Some significant challenges in Bosnia. Obviously, the weather was one of our greatest challenges. The terrain also, because it was quite mountainous in places too, and of course, there's always the threat from unfriendly parties. Although the war by now, the civil war was over. So it tended to be protest votes if anyone did shoot at us, rather than anyone actively trying to take us down. But the weather was a serious factor, and I raise because the weather in the UK can similarly be quite capricious. And one moment you've got sunshine, the next minute you've got fog, and that's exactly what we had here at Odeon today. And you can get caught out, and in Bosnia people did get caught out, and we had one incident where a detachment from another nation managed to fly one of their helicopters into a ridgeline as they tried to sneak through what they thought was a clearing, but turned out to be fog capping a mountaintop. So the training that we'd had for these detachments in Norway proved to be immensely valuable. And again, the lesson from that is that as much preparation as you can get, as much training as you can give yourself, it's always going to be worth it in the long run, even if you might question it, because it all adds to your experience levels when it really does come to crunch time. So I did have a lot of fun in Bosnia. We got to do things like flying the shows around, the morale shows, or CFC shows as they were known, and getting to meet people like Terry Hadley. I think I've got Tony Hadley, I think the name was, the pop star, and comedians, and the likes of Linda Lusardi as well, who I'd always had a crush on when I was much younger. So it's a good fun, but as I said, a serious business, and it was always brought home to you when you went to places like Sarajevo, because even then, some years after the Civil War, I mean, you could see the state that Sarajevo was in, and everywhere we flew, villages and towns were out in the countryside were literally just razed to the ground and still abandoned. So it was quite a salutary lesson in what can go wrong. We flew lots of people out there. I was fortunate enough to fly our Prime Minister on a couple of occasions, as well as other ministers, and it was an excellent operational environment and a learning environment for all the crews that went through there. The next operation, which I think I really got to mention, was Operation Provide Comfort, and this is actually winding the clock back from Bosnia, which was in the mid-90s. I didn't get to go to the Gulf War in 1990. I was on the squadron, on 7th Squadron at the time. I was the squadron NBC officer, nuclear biological and chemical warfare officer. I should have gone, but we needed one crew to go to Northern Ireland, so being one of the youngest captains on the squadron, I went there instead, much to my frustration, as you might imagine. But immediately after the Gulf War, some of you may recall that Saddam Hussein moved against the Kurds in the north and started to drive them out and into Turkey. So of course there was a humanitarian crisis that went on, and we were tasked with sending 2 Chinooks out initially from the UK, flying them all the way out to northern Iraq via Turkey, and operating there whilst the rest of the squadron got back from Iraq, reconstituted, and then eventually came out to join us. And that was a very interesting mission. So it was very much a humanitarian relief mission. Hence the Operation Provide Comfort label that it got. And at first we ended up in a Turkish base up in the Hakkari Mountains, it had been, I think we'd been on the ground about 5 minutes after our initial arrival, and we were unloading the back of the aircraft, surrounded by Turkish soldiers, most of whom were conscripts, helping us to unload these 2 Chinooks. And I looked around for my helmet bag, which didn't have my helmet in. It had all my personal effects, cameras, passports, documents, and other such valuables, and it was gone. And I just couldn't find it anywhere. And I just assumed that someone had picked it up and put it into a vehicle and had mistakenly taken it. So I wasn't too worried at first. So eventually transpired that we couldn't find it. So we mentioned it to the base commander, who then proceeded to turn the base upside down in an attempt to find this helmet bag. Because of course he was embarrassed and didn't want to lose face. It was never found. And I did ask the base commander on one occasion, so if you had found it, what would have happened? And he said, well, I would have shot him. I'm kind of, although it was frustrating losing all my stuff, I'm very glad that I didn't find the bag, because the individual would have been summarily executed. Again, an interesting lesson in cultures then, and something which I was very mindful going forward on future operations, that I always then made an effort to make sure that I understood the culture of the place that I was going to be operating from and operating into as well, so that I didn't end up either embarrassing ourselves or embarrassing the government, or worse, as it may have been in the case. On one occasion, when we were out there, we were resupplying a Kurdish group up in the mountains, and as we were there, a stream of Hercules went over the top and started pushing out pallets out the back, floating down on parachutes, basically over the top of where we were trying to resupply by helicopter. They had been unaware that we were in the area, and we were certainly unaware that there was going to be a pallet drop by Hercules. And again, a good lesson in deconfliction and communication and understanding who is operating where and when. Now, as it turned out, there was no harm done. We flew out from underneath the parachute flight path. And then once they'd all hit the ground, we went back and delivered our own cargoes. The interesting thing was that the pallets were all meals ready to eat, but the Kurds were, majority of them were Muslim, and therefore wouldn't eat pork, and most of the supplies were actually with pork. but they didn't waste them. They actually used them to build the floors and walls for their winter accommodation as we were moving into winter at the time. So a classic case of waste not, want not by them as well. So anyway, that's a little diversion in the story there. So from the 90s, as I said, Operation Provide Comfort was the stand-up one for there. We did lots and lots of like exercises in Germany where we were still fighting the Soviet hordes at the time, but then obviously with the fall of the Soviet Union in '89, all of that doctrine and the military structures within Europe changed, and we stopped doing that, and we started to get busy on ops. So I mentioned Bosnia, and then of course we had Kosovo, and then later in the early 2000s we had Sierra Leone, and then of course we were back to the Gulf and back to Afghanistan after that as well. But whilst all this was going on, I left the Chinook force in 2000 and joined the Operational Evaluation Unit at RAF Benson, and it was my job there as the flight commander to conduct trials on the Chinook and on seekings for new equipment and also new tactics and procedures. So that was normally it was a ground tour, but I got to remain flying, which is fantastic. And it was in my time there that the UK started to send troops and Chinooks into Afghanistan after the 2001 incident. So we're talking about 2002 now, and it quickly became apparent that a lot of the conditions that they were meeting meant that they needed new equipment. So I was fortunate enough to be involved on the Chinook in developing what was then known as the Night Enhancement Package, or the NEP, and we formed an integrated team, which gave us the rather amusing acronym of INEP, the Integrated Night Enhancement Package Team, which we used for a while, and the wing commander who was leading the team was very happy to sign himself as the INEP's leader, which we thought was very funny, but eventually we were told to stop using it as our reports were slowly getting higher and higher up the chain of command. Great shame, but it was fun while it lasted. But the Night Enhancement Package was a really interesting and challenging program, because within 6 months we had to significantly improve the navigation capability of the Chinook. We had to significantly improve the night vision systems on the Chinook. We had to provide head-up displays. We had to put in FLIR onto the aircraft. We had to add an inertial navigation system as well. We had to upgrade the weapon system. We had to upgrade radio technology to provide SATCOM and beyond line of sight. We also had to provide an optional system. So with all of that, and we had to provide the training for the 7th Squadron crews who were ready to go back into theatre within the 6-month timeline. And we achieved that, but we wouldn't have done it under what was then the old model of delivering new capabilities. And what we did was the OEU, the Operational Evaluation Unit, which I was in, was combined with the Chinook fielding flight which was based down at Odium, again commanded by another squadron leader, and it was their responsibility to bring in the new marks of Chinook, and the two of us then integrated with the test pilots at Boscombe Down. Hence and that, along with the engineering authority, was what the integrated team was about. So rather than that sequential, develop the idea, test at Boscombe Down for safety, and then evaluate for suitability and for tactics and doctrine, we essentially ran those all in parallel. So we started flying the sorties with a test pilot from Boscombe Down and an operational evaluation pilot from the OEU or from the Chinook development flight, and that worked really, really well, and we were able to deliver all of those capability enhancements within the 6 months. I mean, it was a tremendous period, and I have to say one of the most rewarding that I've had in my service career, from pure perspective of being allowed to crack on and get things done because they needed doing, a real sense of urgency, and for a very good reason. But after that, change of temper for me, I ended up going to the Ministry of Defence for what was essentially my very first ground tour, a proper ground tour, no flying involved at all. And I went to the Directorate of Air Staff in a role whereby I was responsible for managing upper airspace and everything that connected the ground to upper airspace. So upper airspace being everything that started above flight level 245. Now you can imagine, as a helicopter pilot, I was somewhat confused by this, and I could not see how I could possibly have been considered suitable for the role. But in finest military traditions, it was always a case of crack on, and you'll pick it up as you go along. And indeed, that is what I did. And in hindsight, it was quite an enjoyable 18 months, and I literally was designing airspace with other experts, me not being an expert, on maps, using rulers and marker pens, and new airspace corridors, because the competition for airspace between commercial and military is quite fierce. And of course, we were looking at the introduction of Typhoon into service back then as well. And this was an aircraft that could super cruise and covered far more airspace in a typical air-to-air scenario than the Tornado had before that. So that competition for airspace was becoming intense, and of course, commercial air travel was picking up at a phenomenal rate as well. So a really interesting time. And then when I was halfway through that 18 months, I also picked up responsibility for unmanned air vehicles. And up until then, the Assistant Chief of the Air Staff, for whom I worked, didn't have an expert on unmanned air systems, and we were, as a force, just about to start introducing the Predator into service as well. So in the absence of anyone else, I was double hatted and told that I was going to be the unmanned air officer, desk officer as well. Again, I pointed out that I knew absolutely nothing about them, and I was told, we'll go and learn. Fortunately, I was given a budget, so I did go and learn. I went to various NATO establishments that were dealing with UAVs, and I was also lucky enough to be able to go out to the United States and visit the Air Force and the Navy UAV battle labs, and learnt on the job. And that was said. That was a fascinating 18 months. I like to think that it went well, but the fact that I was replaced by 2 other officers for the airspace stuff and 2 officers for the UAV stuff, either meant that I was incredibly capable, or I'd made such a mess of it. There was a lot of people needed to sort it out. I like to think the former, but I won't preclude the latter. So that was my tour in the MOD, my only ground tour up until that point, and then I was selected to go to the Defence Academy for Advanced Command and Staff course in 2004, and graduated from there in 2005. And I was lucky enough, because there is an element of luck involved in being selected for Squadron Command. The competition is fierce, as you might imagine, and I was delighted to be told that I would be taking over 28 Squadron, which was a Merlin Squadron based at RAF Benson. So I went to Benson in 2005, did the OCU, and it was interesting because I think if I had to do a physical comparison between the Chinook and the Merlin, it was a little bit like getting out of a truck and into a Ford pickup. A slightly smaller but nonetheless capable lifter, but a lot smoother and a lot quieter and a lot less vibration. That was a great couple of years with the Merlin Force, and in that time I was fortunate enough to take the squadron out to Iraq. We were operating out of Basra as the helicopter support to the multinational division Southeast, which was the British area of responsibility, and that was an extremely interesting period. To say that it was lively in theatre is an understatement. I mentioned earlier that Bosnia was relatively benign, just some protest shots on occasion from the locals. That was definitely not the case in Iraq, and we certainly had to have our wits about us as we operated. And of course, being the squadron commander, I had ultimate responsibility for people's training and people's safety whilst they were away. I went out as much as I could because I felt that was only the right thing to do, and I was also nominated by the Joint Helicopter Command to go out for 4 months as the commanding officer for the Joint Helicopter Force. So not only was I responsible for the Merlin detachment, but also for the Lynx detachment and for the Army Air Corps. Sorry, for the Navy Sea Kings as well. So that was the Joint Helicopter Force. We were based at the airfield or the airport, I should say, at Basra, what is now Basra International Airport. And I mentioned the threat. We were continually subjected to rocket attacks on the airfield, and then whilst we're out and about flying, small arms fire, mortars when we're on landing sites, and I think at least on one occasion, if not 2, we were never able to confirm surface-to-air missiles as well. Unfortunately, the Merlin, a fantastic aircraft, very well served with defensive aid suites, and we had no serious incidents while we were there, or at least while I was responsible for operations out there. I did get to my office at Basra on one morning after a particularly lively night of rocket attacks to find that I couldn't open the office door, and the reason for that was that a rocket had actually exploded right next to the building and knocked down the end wall. And so the reason I couldn't open the door was because the rubble was blocking it. And that was, I've got to say, was somewhat frustrating, as you might imagine, because it had made a real mess of my office. So it was very real, but very exciting. If that makes any sense at all, it's kind of what you signed up for, and I'm absolutely delighted to say that the crews, without exception, were fantastic, and a couple of my pilots were awarded distinguished flying crosses in their time. Several other awards, and there were many who should have received rewards, but didn't, and that's just the way the system works. So a really fascinating period on operations then. Meanwhile, back at home, the Merlin force had to reorganise. We were slightly short of aircraft. We had 22 at the time, and we were given orders to incorporate the 6 aircraft from the Danish Air Force, which they decided that they didn't need. Now, from the outside, they looked like the same aircraft, but essentially they were very different cockpits, some different systems. So, for example, they had weather radar, they had other systems which weren't the same as ours. So we were bringing on board a similar aircraft, but it's sufficiently different that we had to introduce a different training requirement for it. I was lucky enough to be working alongside Nigel Coleman, who today is Commander, Joint Helicopter Command. Back then he was a fellow wing commander, and he was tasked with essentially the hard work of introducing these new Merlin Mark 3As, as they became known, into service. And it was just my role to integrate those new aircraft into the squadron. Eventually, it became obvious that 28 Merlins was just too much for one squadron commander, and the decision was made to split the force into 2 squadrons, and 78 Squadron was established, and Nigel Coleman became the first of the new OC-78s. So we went from 1 squadron of Merlin with 22 aircraft to 2 squadrons, sharing a pool of 28. And at about the same time, we also started to introduce Navy crews, because by now the decision had been made that we would be handing the Merlin over to the Royal Navy, so that they could then replace their Sea Kings in the Commander Helicopter Force. And again, it was a great opportunity to operate alongside Navy, not just alongside, but with Navy personnel, bringing their experiences and their ways of doing business. It was an intense but very enjoyable couple of years. And so that takes us through to 2008, at which point I left the service. I had reached an option point in my career. You have option points where you can leave without losing out, and after all those years, I felt I owed my family an opportunity to live a more normal life, and at the same time, I had a great job offer from Augusta Westland, as the company now known as Leonardo Helicopters was named back then. So I left the service and joined Augusta Westland, and I started my second career as an advisor to the military helicopter side of the business, which was a steep learning curve. We do things very in a very specific way in the military, and we are extremely well trained, but there's no doubt that the business world has a different approach to doing business, and it was quite a change of scene. But that was sweetened by being asked after a year if I would like to move to Italy and work from their headquarters in Cascina Costa, which basically shares the airfield with Milan Malpensa Airport, just south of the lakes in the north of Italy. And I was lucky enough to be there for 2 years, which was absolutely fantastic. Came back from there. So by now I was in the company nearly 5 years in 2014, and the life of international jet setting and business development had been great fun. But again, the circumstances had changed, and the office where I was based in Farnborough was closing because of a company reorganisation, and I had the option of moving down to Yeovil, but that was most firmly vetoed by the family. But I had the opportunity of joining the Air Force again as a full-time reservist, and so this was the second time I joined. So I did, and I went to Kuwait in January 2015 as the senior air advisor to the commander of the Kuwaiti Air Force. And while I was there, I was asked if I would like to instruct on the Gazelle helicopter, which I had instructed on back in the UK. By now, I hadn't flown for over 5.5 years, so the opportunity was too great to miss. So along with my responsibilities in the headquarters, I also got to fly from Ali Al Salem on the Kuwaiti's Gazelle helicopters, which was a lovely aircraft, refurbished by the French to a very good standard, and as I said, an absolute joy to fly and to teach Kuwaiti baby pilots how to fly helicopters before they transitioned on to Puma, Super Puma, and Apache helicopters. Sadly, that was only a 2-year posting. I came back. I went to the Defence Academy then as one of the staff on the Advanced Command and Staff course. So having been a student in 0405, I was now a member of staff, 16, 17, and 17, 18 on the 2 courses then. Again, great fun, very different looking at life from the other side of the fence. I can confirm that it was much more fun and less stressful being a member of staff than it was being a student. But it was also good fun having several of the students on the course either former squadron people that I'd known from the past. So that was absolutely tremendous. And at the end of that, so we're talking now summer 2019, that was my reserve service complete. It was a 4-year contract, and because of the way that reserve contracts work, I couldn't just stay at Defence Academy, which they would have liked me to have done. So I was essentially I left for the second time. Just before I did leave, literally as I was whilst I was busy handing back stuff and completing paperwork and interviewing for jobs back in Civvy Street, the RAF personnel office asked if there was anything I would like to do to stay in, to which I by email rather flippantly wrote, but you know what, the only thing I'd be interested in is flying. Now, given that I was in my 50s by now, I assumed that they'd have a giggle, take it for the joke that it was meant to be, and bid me farewell. Imagine my surprise when the next morning I got an email back saying Okay, that's fine. You can well, we'll offer you a cockpit Puma OCU starting in November, but you have to join as a regular. I'm going to demote you from Wing Commander Flight Lieutenant. How about it? To which, of course, I said, yeah, absolutely. So I get to fly an aircraft I haven't flown before, the Puma, the last of the big three, if you like, Chinook, Merlin, and Puma, the big three green helicopters. And you're going to make me a flight lieutenant, so I'll have no responsibilities executive-wise whatsoever. I'm just there to enjoy the flying. So yeah, I took the job, did the Puma OCU November 19 through to about April 20, and then I was assigned to the Operational Evaluation Unit again. So nearly 20 years after my first placement to the OEU, I was back. But initially, I was seconded to 230 Squadron, and over the summer of 20, we worked up in preparation for deployment to Kabul on Octoral 11, as it was, and we deployed in late September and came back in the January of this year, mid-January. So there, finally, I managed to get to Afghanistan, which I'd not done, and I'd always wanted to. I'd always been fascinated by the theatre, and got to fly in and out of Kabul airport, again up to Basra and down to the south, and various few locations in and around, and through the winter months as well, which again in the mountains around Kabul certainly added a fresh challenge to operations. So essentially that brings me to where I am now. I'm Flight Lieutenant on the Operational Evaluation Unit on the Puma desk. I mentioned to Paul, some of you may have heard in that of course we are now awaiting confirmation of what's actually happening to the Puma force, because the defence review that sat early in the year and reported in March identified the Puma as one of the fleets that was going to be chopped, and the thing that we're waiting on now is when the actual service date is going to be, and we're anticipating sometime next year. In the meantime, I and the team that I'm on have started assisting with all the scoping work required for the next generation medium helicopter, which is also in the defence announcement made at the beginning of the year, and of course that's tremendously exciting to be in at the very beginning of a new helicopter acquisition, to be informing the user requirements and helping to shape a helicopter that will be in service probably for the next 20 years or so, from around about the mid-20s and onwards. So lots to still look forward to ahead. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking there. I've been flicking through my notes. I've got more dits and yarns and stories that I can possibly cover, but I'm mindful that we've got just over 25 minutes left. What I'd like to do now, Paul, if that's okay, is hand control to the audience, and just explore any issues or questions related to either what I've done, what I'm doing, or just aviation or helicopter flying, that you would like, and I'm happy to take it anywhere. So over to you.
Thanks, Rich. Can I be selfish and ask the first question? What's going to happen to the Pumas?
You're going to buy one, aren't you, Paul?
Well, you know.
Yeah.